But Dave, what, in your opinion, is the most interesting, new thing around the MySQL ecosystem that you've seen in the last year or two? Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Haas Talks Foss. I am the Haas, Matt Yonkovit, head of open source strategy at Percona. And today we are joined with one of Percona's newest employees, Dave Stokes. Dave, welcome to Percona.
Well, thank you. I enjoy being here.
Yes. So, if you are in the MySQL community, you probably know Dave from the many years that he has spent giving us all kinds of interesting, cool, conference talks, blog posts. He's been a super active member of the community for years and years. In fact, many of us at Percona have worked with Dave previously when he worked at MySQL or at Oracle. And when I hired Dave, I got a lot of pings and said, "Oh my God, Dave's joining us." Now, I don't know, Dave, maybe that was a good thing or a bad thing. I tried to clarify, and most people thought it was positive, so you're in the clear there. But, when somebody says, "Oh my God, Dave's joining us," it could go either way,
right? Hopefully not. Hopefully it's all for the positive.
Yes, it was all for the positive. So Dave is joining us to help us in the community team, to help us on the DevRel side and, the evangelism side, continuing the work that he's been doing in the MySQL space for all these years. And I figured it would be good to do an introduction and let people out in the community who watch the podcast, who follow us on YouTube or on Twitch or wherever we're streaming, to get an introduction to Dave, learn a little bit about him, and hear about some of his experiences. So, Dave, why don't you introduce yourself to our vast audience? And by the way, I don't know if you knew this, but we actually achieved #1 status in Tunisia for this podcast, for our demographic.
Ooh.
So open source database, technical, content in Tunisia, we're like the top podcast.
Glad to hear that. Will drive my Q rating, which will make me even more popular.
Yes,
Woo-hoo.
yes. So thank you to those in Tunisia tuning in.
Yes. Let's see. Background. Many years ago, I was working at a university on the West Coast, University of San Diego, and the vendor that we chose for our hardware kept killing off the operating systems that we use, Ristus-E, TOPS 10, TOPS 20. And I got the ability to load up one of our older machines with a version of Unix. And from then on, I was really thinking, this is really neat. People are contributing all over the world to this operating system to add features. And a little while later, you hear about this crazy guy from Finland. Somehow, in the open source world, was always a crazy guy in Finland who created this operating system that he was giving away. Many years ago, you used to have to buy your operating system from the vendor that made your hardware, and you couldn't take that software to someone else's hardware.
Yeah, and they were expensive too, right? Like when you were talking Unix, it was like $100,000.
Well, I was lucky at a university. We only had to pay $300 to Berkeley to get the 1600 BPI magnetic reel tape.
Oh,
and we were hot stuff. Anyway, many years later, I'm at the American Heart Association. I was putting them on the internet, and we had a need for a database. And at the time in the open source world, there was one called MySQL. And it sort of worked. It really wasn't free. And then yet another crazy guy from Finland says, we have this thing called MySQL. It's got to be a better product. It has an extra letter in the name. And ever since then, I've been using MySQL. About the same time, I discovered PHP. So thanks to Rasmus Lurdorf and Monty Wadenis, that's pretty much been the core of my career ever since. And in 2007, I was expanding my horizons by taking the MySQL certification for DBA 5.0. And back then, it was 2 tests to get the certification. And I failed the second test by 1 question. And a lot of the questions were kind of poorly worded. And at the same time, I saw a notice on forums for MySQL that they were looking for a PHP developer. And I figured, well, let me see what's going on. So I wrote a letter that was half complaint about, hey, some of your questions really need to be tightened up a little bit. and half, hey, this is why you need to hire me. And surprise, surprise, I got hired by MySQL AB. And that was a little bit of a shock. I mean, this was a very small company, global reach, people all over the place, and very exciting customer base. That's the thing that really, I guess, be going about MySQL. And same thing I see in the Postgres and Mongo communities out there, and what I see growing with like Proxy SQL and some other tools out there, is that the community is always doing something different. It used to be you go to a conference and you hear something in the hallway track that would instantly make you go down the rabbit hole with some of the new approach to doing stuff. And there's always innovation, there's always creativity, and there's always something new happening. It's not static. A lot of the software bases out there, I won't name them for various reasons. You go back after 6 months and see, oh, what have they done? Have they changed anything? Nope, they're still arguing the same things. No one's really done anything. But the MySQL community and the open source database community is generally very vibrant. What's real interesting is, especially in the open source database world, when I talk to the folks from Postgres, the few folks I've talking through Mongo, we're a lot more alike than we are different. And the approaches change a little bit. But they're all kind of, how do we make things better? How do we make the product better? How do we make it more accessible? How do we make it more redundant? How do we make it safer? And it's a very interesting niche to be in.
Yeah. And Dave, so we joined MySQL AB the same year. I don't know if you knew that, in 2007, which was 2 years before the Oracle purchase.
Yes.
Right.
And for those of you who were not there, we were told by Martin Mikos, you have to be in the room, in the conference room at 7:55 precisely. And everyone's going, gee, Martin's never been a stickler for time before. What's going on? And they handed out shots of vodka, which for me was a little bit of a shock. But I guess that's
at
the
8
way
a.m. in
things
the
were done.
morning, shots of vodka for everyone at MySQL AB to announce that Sun had acquired MySQL.
And then a year and a quarter later, I'm at the MySQL users group meeting or user show, and I turn on Channel 2 News in San Francisco. Big news in the Silicon Valley. Oracle has bought Sun Microsystems. And I started texting some of my coworkers who were saying, you really weren't drinking that much last night. Where are you getting this from? Turn on the news. We've been sold. So that was kind of an exciting thing.
No, I was actually in, we had shared rooms as part of the professional service team, right? So, we had double room, and I was with E. Trudeau. And I remember getting up at 5 or 6 or whatever. And I saw that and I'm like, oh my God, and he, was kind of half awake, what are you complaining about? And I go, we just got bought. He's like, by who? And it's like Oracle. And he's like, what?
Well, the old MySQL professional services group was quite an impressive group.
Yes,
I got to know Brian. I got to know Brian Majeski fairly well.
Uh-huh.
This is one of those guys, you'd ask him any obscure question about MySQL, he'd not only give you an A+ answer, but tell you how to work around any issues. And Josh Chalmers, who used to run the group, was very formidable. If you ever were in a discussion with him, you always, I won't say felt intimidated, but you could tell that he was always negotiating from a point of strength. And you guys would work 4 days a week and then spend the 5th day writing up the customer review action list of what was going on.
Oh, not as much as you would think. That might have been the goal, but a lot of times it was 5 days and then you just kind of wrote it on your own. So it was kind of a back and forth. It depended on who you were working with and what they wanted. But back then it was road warrior time, right? So I spent 46 weeks out of the year on the road, being dropped into a new customer every week, or sometimes 2 customers a week. And, you would go in and get MySQL humming. You would tune some Linux stuff. You'd tune some Apache stuff. You'd kind of do everything. to get, whatever that particular customer wanted. And, I mean, you're talking about a who's who of, Silicon Valley at the time. It was quite an intense position because you were doing so much so quick, right? It was amazing how much you turned things over and how quickly you did. And it's great to see so many people move on from that team and from the early days of MySQL into, greater things, right? You've got Yoshinori, for instance, over at Facebook, spent a ton of time building, out there, RocksDB. You've got Monty Taylor, who was very active in the OpenStack community, and Drizzle, and is now at Oracle, right? He's kind of gone through the paces, but he was one of the top contributors for OpenStack for years. Brian Aker, obviously, from a overall perspective, has moved on and done a ton of other things with HP and other companies. So there's a lot of really awesome technical people who went on to achieve a lot of great things post MySQL AB, which is often cool to see. And I know there's hundreds of others, and I didn't mention you. It's not because I didn't, like, there's so many, right? I mean, there just is. And you see that kind of tree, if you will, right, where people have come out and accomplished so much. So I think those early days always have a special place in my heart, at least, and kind of introduced me to that open source philosophy and lifestyle. So I always hold that special place.
The other thing that impressed me when I first joined was I was taking one of the MySQL classes. I think it was the Dba class, just to kind of get a feel for it. And Sarah Spurnell was teaching it. And what was interesting is she had her notes up. She had a chat line going. She had 3 other ways of communication. So she was talking to the software engineers who were writing the code when she had questions. She talked to other instructors. She talked to the various program managers. And if someone had a really out of the ballpark question, she could very quickly answer it, which I thought, wow, these folks really, really support each other.
Yeah. Well, and, you mentioned Sarah, and, she's gone on to have a heck of a career leading, organizations around, support and customer success, and, worked at a plethora of companies that have gone to unicorn status.
Yes.
And I remember she was one of the trainers, her and Tobias, when I started. And, first week you always had to go through training. And it was Eve and I in training the same week before we actually officially started. And that was my first introduction to a few of the MySQL folks. But no, I mean, it was great times back then. And like I said, so many great people. Now, Dave, you continued your MySQL journey with Oracle for many, many years. And what I'm really curious about is being part of this community. Why has the MySQL community for you just been your home and a place that you love? Like, what has led to that kind of, like, you haven't wanted to leave the MySQL community? You wanted to just continue to, thrive and excel in that space. What attracts you to that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's an innovation. You see new stuff going on all the time. Also, it's very interesting. You see a small business that claws their way into existence, and they start running MySQL backend for WordPress or something like that. And you see them start to grow and evolve and develop. And it's a very nice incubation tool to see someone go from 0 to a trillion fairly quickly. And also the people in the community are just fantastic. Used to be when I went to trade shows, even when I ran into someone who was upset with MySQL, they were still using MySQL. And it's one of those things where it's just a great starting point for so many businesses, and there's so much you can do with it. Now, I've heard you talk about, you need to make sure you architect things right, and even when people don't do that, you still get fairly decent performance out of it. Now, in the Postgres world, which I love, there's I wouldn't say there's a lot more rigor to developing things, but the community there is as dynamic, probably looking for a good term here. It's a similar vein, and I need to get into that better. I used to go to computer shows, and when you're at a computer show, they close down this thing. You go out to dinner with the other computer geeks. So you end up talking with them. And the passion you see there is the same as you see in MySQL. It's just that I think MySQL is a little more in my focus because I'm dealing with it every day.
Yeah, and from my experience from a Postgres perspective, the community is outstanding. They're very welcoming. They are deeply technical. And I think part of the difference between the MySQL and the Postgres community is a lot of the folks in the Postgres community are core contributors. And since it is a community-driven project that has many companies that contribute, whether it's, Crunchy or EDB or Percona or others that provide, engineering talent, it's still a collective that is developing the core of Postgres. Whereas MySQL, it's an Oracle-owned company. It was a MySQL-owned company. So the majority of the engineering resources were in the one company. So that's where I see the big difference is it's more of a technical collaboration, whereas in the MySQL community, you have a wide swath of user community, right? So people who are extending as opposed to really building the core, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I also wondered, you see so many open source projects where you have the benevolent dictator for life.
Yes.
And the exact opposite of the spectrum is Postgres, where everything's very distributed, very non-directive. And it's kind of interesting to see how the two approaches work. And the great thing is both approaches work.
Right. Yeah.
So.
No, and I mean, and this is where it's a slightly different use case, a slightly different area. And, there's room for both. And, that people always ask, like, MySQL and Postgres. And the answer isn't one or the other. It's both, right? And I think that both have their place and both can do awesome things. And I think it's counterproductive to argue specifically about, like which database is better. It's not like there's going to be a street fight between the two.
Well, if they were, it'd be very short-lived and very messy. I don't.
Yes. So Dave, in like the last few years, we've seen an immense evolution in the database space, both in MySQL, Postgres, elsewhere. So I'm curious, like, what have you seen, in your travels, in your community engagement? What are some of the things that are kind of popping up over and over again as you have talked to people out in that user space? What's on the top of their minds?
Well, 11 and a half years ago when I started being a community manager.
By the way, I said you recent, not 11 and a half years, Dave.
Yeah. The old problems were I'm a Linux admin and I got this database. How do I keep it running?
Yeah.
And that's kind of shifted to being, hi, I'm a reliability engineer. I've never actually seen my hardware. It's all up in the cloud. How do I keep it running?
Right.
So the focus has changed from, how do I keep this box that I can literally go and percussively hit when it's not behaving to what I want, to this virtual thing that's somewhere, somehow, and actually has multiple instances, other somehows in some places. It's a big shift. The other great thing is that in the old days, your database started running out of disk space. Okay, well, I got to put in a capital request to have my business go out and purchase a disk drive, which means purchasing's got to get involved. The tax compliance people might be involved, all this other stuff. And then you got to schedule downtime to plug in this disk, reformat it, spread things around. Now you want more disk space, you call up and hopefully your credit card has more money on it. The days of having to sweat over, do I do a write through or write back cache on my disk drives? No one's arguing that anymore, except for very small groups. The focus has changed away from how to mechanically do things to how do I logically do things.
Yeah, no, and I mean it's a good point. And you mentioned SREs, who now it's an SRE who has to deal with the database once in a while. I think it's also the developers who have to, right? So it's more and more. I've trusted, that hey, the cloud service is going to take care of the database for me. They're my quote unquote DBA, without realizing that there's a lot more activity that has to happen. So there's definitely a need for smarter tooling, smarter, AI maybe, or even like just that knowledge on how to fix those things quickly when they do come up and cause issues.
Well, there's still going to be a need for the traditional DBA functions of tuning queries, making sure the data types match the use, and planning for growth of the tables. A lot of the old stuff, like backups, that's much more easily done now. You actually don't have someone running and changing tapes anymore, or that sort of work. So what's interesting to me is how
there used to be just a person who would walk through, and take tapes out and put them in like containers and ship them off site, right?
Yeah. Well, it's not like the old days where you'd see an old engineer with a pocket protector, will punch cards for money or for food. But it's interesting to see how the focus has changed.
Yeah, definitely.
And the size of the databases have gotten absolutely amazing. I was talking to someone who's got a 15 terabyte test set from their 4 petabyte data lake. And that's their test set. And
yeah, that's a pretty big test set. But you want to test in a realistic scenario. So I guess,
and not that long ago, we were talking about, we have to run Hadoop to do MapReduce, all this to get things down to a small coalesce size so we can actually process it. That's out the window.
Yeah. It's interesting because when you talk about the explosive data sizes that have happened, we do have more and more data. And you talk about, you mentioned like data lake. And the funny thing is there's so many disparate sources of data now that's where this data lake concept, we used to call it a data warehouse, right? Or a data mart or, operational data store. I mean, there's a bazillion terms for something that's been around for basically forever. But the idea that there's all of this different data in all of these different places, and you want to kind of pool it together or put it in some place that you can easily access it and combine it and do some activities. It's not a new concept, but I think that two things have really changed it, right? And so I think the first is we don't want to get rid of anything, right? Like there is so much out there collecting so much data on all of us, and everyone is scared to death that they might lose some competitive advantage if they get rid of some data or don't store it if it's available. They want to store everything, forever and ever and ever, right? And I think that has led to an additional burden on a lot of the systems. When you look at the different database technologies, there's really now a database for almost every potential use case. I saw that there's DB Engines lists over 350 different databases that they're tracking, and several of them I have seen in use at one particular customer or another. You might have customers now or users who have 8 to 10 different databases that they're storing data in, and they have some need to combine that data or access it in a unified way.
Well, what's scary is a acquaintance of mine is a DBase 2 expert. For those of you who've never heard of it, this is back in the early days of PCs. Now, this person's new claim to fame is that they have it running on a PC, and there's lawyers involved in a court case where someone had some frozen data from a business deal gone bad, and they're in the middle of litigation now. And they have data that's 20 some odd years old that they have to store and maintain and keep pristine. Considering how quickly we evolve from various storage engines and, various storage methods, would we be able to actually be able to come back and say, okay, 5 years from now, can we come back to March 3rd, 2022 and have an exact representation of the data because someone's trying to prove something in a court of law? Scary.
That is, right? I mean, I think that the pace of technology makes that increasingly difficult, especially if you're only relying on backups, which means that a lot of people have resorted to just leaving the data live in whatever active system they have currently, even if it is not accessed that often.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, if you haven't recently tried to buy a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk, it's an exercise in futility.
Do they actually sell them? I don't even know. I'm sure that they.
I'm sure everything's available on Amazon these days. But I'm sure
you're not going to buy new ones, right? Like you're not going to. It's like buying a new VHS player. The last VHS, the company that made VHS players went out of business, so you're going to buy it on the secondhand market. But
ironically, Sony's still making Betamax, I've been told. So
there you go.
It's for the industrial uses and the broadcast networks.
But Dave, you're dating us with this technology on the 5 1/2 quarter. Yeah. So let's look at the future.
Future, I think, is kind of interesting, especially when you see things like the Json datatype. It's funny how all the relational databases were bragging on the NoSQL databases that were mainly JSON based. That, hey, you guys aren't transactional, so they said, okay, we're going to become transactional. Meanwhile, all the relational databases, Oracle, Postgres, MySQL, SQL Server, added a JSON data type. And it's kind of like, well, are they just trying to do a checkbox out there? Because, hey, if we have this out there, we can kind of, wave that over the opposition's head. No, actually, the JSON data type has turned out to be very valuable because there's so much data being sent out in JSON. It's nice to be able to capture it and store it in that native data type. And the uses of that are real exciting to me because you have the ability to have highly immutable data on top of a fairly rigid relational structure. And that works very well for a lot of folks. And also a couple of years ago, the Json Schema.org folks came out. And by the way, they like to be called brilliant. I did that in a blog post one time and I got a lot of positive feedback for that. Came up with a way to get rid of the one thing that always made me cringe about JSON was that there was no way to have rigor on your data. If I was storing a JSON document and I had a email tag and I was spelling it EMAIL, all lowercase, and you were doing it with camel case and someone else was typing out electronic mail, there was no way to actually force the data to be what you wanted in the format you wanted. Anyway, these folks worked out a way by setting up an exemplar that you check the document against before it checks into your data. So you don't get the bad data into the database. And it's easier to keep bad data out than try to go back and fix bad data. So all these little innovations like that I see as big step forwards for us.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that brings to mind 2 points, right? So one of the benefits that people extol about JSON is the flexibility, which is difficult if you're doing schema or JSON validation, because if it's not validatable, then it is rejected, and therefore, in some people's minds, it's not flexible. So there is some weirdness that goes on with people, right? Because, if you're looking for certain validation within that document, that kind of negates some of that flexibility in some people's minds. So that is.
Well, how many times have you opened up someone's data table and you've seen, everything's a varchar 255, all 25 columns, and they're storing string data in there.
Yeah. Hey.
And they somehow concatenate together.
I get it. right? I'm saying that, this is where a lot of people extol the virtues of schemaless or this flexible, design without realizing what the implications necessarily are of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing that kind of comes to mind is the cyclical nature of technology, right? We live we've been around long enough, Dave, where we have seen things kind of repeat, right? I mean, let's be honest. Whether it's, virtualized versus containers, versus, or it's, sharing resources like the cloud, these things are not concepts that are new necessarily. It's just that we see the cyclical nature of technology. And what we see is there are patterns. And I can tell you one of the patterns that comes and goes is uh, consolidation versus distribution, or central control versus distributed control. And what I mean by this and how this relates to databases in general and technology is you will see phases where everything is, we need more, right? We need to expand and choose the best thing for the job, followed by a phase where it's like things have become too unruly and we want the flexibility, but we want one thing to control the flexibility, followed by something that says one monolithic control plane is stupid. We want the benefits of all these other things. And so then you have the explosion, and then you have the, consolidation. And so this back and forth between consolidation versus, explosive, growth or technology sprawl, it's a cyclical thing that happens every few years. But you mentioned, back in the Unix days, big iron, right? We want massive boxes and we want less of them. We want more horsepower in the one. We're going to consolidate as much as possible. Nope, we want commodity, we want blade servers. We want, multiple technologies that allow us to scale out. And then we go back to, well, yeah, the scale out was so hard to manage. We're going to come back to a single thing. And then we go back. So, I mean, like this technology cycle cyclical. And it's interesting when you mention things like the JSON data type, because a lot of databases start out, and you can see this pattern where it's, I'm here to solve a specific use case, right? MongoDB document database, we're here to store documents in the BSON or JSON like format. This is what we do, right? We're not worried about transactional workload. We're not worried about this. We're not worried about that. And then at a certain point, they're like, oh, now we're going to add transactional workload. Now we're going to add this. Now we're going to add that. And they start to take what was a very specific use case, which means that you would have technology that sprawls, right, for every use case. You've got a transactional system, you have a transactional database. You have a document database, you have a document database. You have a, need for, Hadoop type workload, you have that, and so you have like each type of technology. Whereas now you start to see some of the bigger vendors say, we need to take the features in these other databases and consolidate them into ours. So then they'll just use ours as the single use case, and everyone can kind of standardize and consolidate on one. And I think
but what is it? 80% of folks running databases have more than one type of database in their environment.
Yeah, more than that. Yeah.
That's the number I remember.
Yeah. And but I think that the vendors and the projects themselves get a lot of pressure because people want to have less things that they're responsible for, because a lot of them are difficult to manage, right? Like, how do you manage all these different disparate technologies? How do you get expertise in it? And so there's that pressure of, ooh, we can help them, but there's also pressure in, we can capture more market share, because when you corner the market in one particular niche use case, to expand, sometimes you need to jump to the adjacent lane, right? Generate a bit more revenue. So if you can have a relational database that all of a sudden does document database type stuff for analytics, it's a jump that you can make because it's one kind of lane over. but it expands your use case. So it's an interesting dynamic in market, because I do see that from a database perspective, more and more databases try to adopt features just to catch up, or just to try and say, look, you can consolidate and use us for everything.
Now, with the consolidation of the cloud, I've heard people argue that we're just kind of going back to kind of a theoretical mainframe environment where there's going to be one box that has all our data, and everyone uses that one box to get all the data out of. And I know mechanically behind the scenes, that's the way it is. But I know a lot of businesses are thinking, well, I don't have to have a PC on everyone's desk. I just have to have them have a way to access the cloud, and the cloud will act as the equivalent of a mainframe for my data.
Yeah, well, and I mean, well, let's that's a whole nother discussion when you talk about like desktops and whatnot from the cloud. But I think that
well, you talk to businesses, everyone has one of these, so let's make that our universal interface to all our data, which hurts.
Well, it's possible, but I think that this is where you could see decentralized computing as something that eventually takes over from some of these centralized resources, right? So right now, you mentioned putting everything in the cloud, and whether that's monolithic or a single point is debatable, but there's a lot of work on decentralized services, especially with blockchain, type technology, and when you look at the finance and crypto space, where you're looking at decentralized identity and decentralized services and decentralized this and that. There's a point where someone will look to figure out how they can utilize that technology to instill or bring kind of a crowdsourcing approach to a lot of the bigger data problems that we have. Whereas you might have, instead of having one centralized controlled server, and this is kind of this idea of serverless, right? You have the idea of serverless right now in a lot of cloud providers and things, where it's like, you don't really have a server, but there is really a server behind the scenes. You just don't know about it. But ultimately what you'd want is to farm out the work, and then wherever it is, it handles the work and gives you the result. And right now, the technology that we have is very specific to that particular data center or that particular provider, but it is possible to cross all the realms and make it truly distributed in the future. Now, I probably sound like a heretic or something, and people will be like, what the hell is he talking about? But that's okay. We've gone into a really weird space here, which I didn't expect, which is cool. You never know where these conversations will head. But Dave, what, in your opinion, is the most interesting, new thing around the MySQL ecosystem that you've seen in the last year or two?
The two things that really made me stop and take a look at them. I'm always reading things like slash.org, the various forums for the various databases, the Reddit forums for the various databases. When you see something like a proxy SQL or a VTest pop up, and it's not run by the main vendor for the database, and you see the swarm of people who go to it because it's solving a need that they have, and as an industry matures, you tend to have consolidation, and things kind of become gelatinous, and they slow down and become messy. But when we see something like Proxy SQL that suddenly is on the scene and doing a whole lot of really neat stuff for a whole lot of people, that's one of those things that you go, yeah, there's fresh blood in the environment that's doing really neat stuff. The other thing that's interesting to me is I'm going out on these forums and looking at all these novices who are coming into the database world, and they haven't had formal schooling in relational theory sets, Boolean logic, and that. But they're going out there and they're using databases to do what they need. And the changes from when I started or or even a couple of years ago, to the ability to have these folks be able to go from 0 to 60 miles an hour, has gotten a lot better. Still not where I think it should be, but these people are able to get in there and use the technology and do pretty amazing stuff fairly quickly.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Dave, welcome to Percona. We appreciate you coming and hanging out with us. You're going to be seeing Dave over the next few months here. Start popping up on live stream, start doing some videos. You're going to see his name on the Percona blog. We're going to put Dave's name in lights. Dave's going to become Percona famous. That's the goal.
Woo-hoo.
Percona famous Dave. So Dave, thanks for hanging out this morning. And if you want to reach out to Dave, feel free to drop him a line, at david.stokes@percona.com, or follow him on his own personal blog or on the Twitterverse. Wherever Dave is, you will see him.
And I hope to see you all at Percona Live.
Oh yes, see, look, he's already making good on his promise to help us out by plugging Percona Live. There you go.
The call for paper is open. It's in Austin, and if you have any questions about Austin, I live a couple hours north of there, but I can tell you all the good places to eat and some other amazing adventures you can have in the nearby area.
Ooh.
So submit that paper today.
Okay, so So Dave's going to be your host down in Austin. So come on down. All right. Bye, everybody.
Adios, amigos.
Wow, what a great episode that was. We really appreciate you coming and checking it out. We hope that you love open source as much as we do. If you like this video, go ahead and subscribe to us on the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And of course, tune in to next week's episode. We really appreciate you coming and talking open source with us.